Okay, for the second part of our unit on the chemistry of life, we're going to talk about macromolecules. Okay, so first of all, what is an organic compound? You've probably heard this word before. They are made up of mainly carbon atoms. When we talk about living things have 6 different elements in them that make them up. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Okay, so these are the 6 elements that make up all living or organic compounds. All living compounds. All right, so if you see anything that just has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, or sulfur, it's more than likely an organic compound. So, when we're talking about life, we're also going to talk about 4 types of what we call macromolecules. So very important things in all living things and cells. They are lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. All right, so what is a macromolecule? You know the word macro means big, so these are bigger molecules. So they're large molecules composed of many subunits called monomers. Okay, so monomers are put together to make what we call a polymer. Okay, so mono means one, poly means many. So we put a couple monomers in to make a polymer that makes up our macromolecules. All right, we have something, so when we have these macromolecules, you eat them and get them in through your food for animals that actually are not autotrophs or that make their own food. And so we have to break them down because they don't always come in the form that we need them. So these monomers that they're made up of can be broken down or put back together through a chemical reaction. And what this is called is we have things called dehydration synthesis, and we're also going to have hydrolysis. So synthesis, or to synthesize, means to make. All right, and dehydration, hydration means water, so you're going to or take out water. Take out H2O. All right, so we take an H and an OH, which would give you H2O, on each side of a monomer, and when we put them together and take out that water, we can make macromolecules. So this is what this looks like. We have a monomer 1 and a monomer 2. Right on each ends of a monomer, there's a hydrogen on one side and a hydroxide or an OH on the other. And when you try and put these two together, right here you get water out. So dehydration, take water out, and then we get a synthesis or making of a macromolecule or a polymer. Okay, the other one we can do is if we want to break these organic molecules down, so like when we eat that food. All right, this is called hydrolysis. So hydro means water again, and lysis means to break. So we're going to put a water in and break it apart. Okay, so this is how we break down those monomers when we eat them so that our cells can use it. All right, so we add water in here, and then so we can get those monomers back and get a hydroxide on one side and a hydrogen on the other. So we add in water, hydro, and we break these compounds down, lysis. All right, so the different types of macromolecules. The first one is lipids. All right, lipids are what we use for long-term energy storage. Okay, they are insoluble in polar substances. All right, so if you've ever heard that fat doesn't really go into water very well, that's because fat is a lipid. All right, so these are not going to be soluble in water because remember, water is a polar molecule. So anything that is nonpolar will not dissolve. All right. Okay, there are 3 different types of lipids that you have in our body. Triglycerides, which we call fats. phospholipids, so these are lipids that make up our cell membranes. So when we go to talk about cells later on in this course, phospholipids are what are going to be all in the membrane. And then steroids. So you've heard of steroids before, and these are all within your cells and within your body. So the first one, triglycerides, are the fat that you actually intake in your diet. All right, we have, it's made up of two parts. This is not as important. I just want you to know that triglycerides are the fat. Okay, it's made up of a glycerol molecule and fatty acid chains, which are these little things that hang down. All right, so there's usually a glycerol molecule up here, and then you can have these little fatty acid chains that are made up of carbon and hydrogen that hang down. All right, and they can be said they're saturated or unsaturated. So our second type of macromolecule are carbohydrates. Okay, so carbohydrates are what you think of as carbs that you eat on a normal day-to-day basis. So these are going to be made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1-to-1 ratio. So all this means is there's double the amount of hydrogen that there are carbons and oxygens. Okay, so glucose is something you've heard of before. This is a simple carbohydrate, so it's not a very complicated one. It's a little bit smaller. And this is in a C6H12O6 ratio, so that there's double the amount of hydrogens that there are carbons and oxygens. And carbohydrates actually function in what we call short-term energy storage, okay, such as sugar. So that sugar rush you've heard of before, or that you've experienced, the reason why you get that is because carbs or sugars are short-term energy, okay? The other thing, we can have a little bit of a intermediate term energy, so not the long, not the short, but for us, we have glycogen, and for plants, it's starches. All right, so these will be a little bit more energy than a short term like sugar, but not as much as the long-term energy storage of fat. All right, carbohydrates, when we go to name these, they are named for the amount of the monomers strung together. The monomers for carbohydrates are called monosaccharides. So for the lipids, we have the triglycerides, steroids, and such, but for the monomers of carbohydrates, we have monosaccharides. So this means there's one. Okay, when we go to multiple of them, a disaccharide means there's two, and poly means there are three or more. Okay, so disaccharides are sugars, monosaccharides just have one, and then poly has three. Okay, for our third type of macromolecule are called proteins. Okay, so these are going to help with control and structural elements of your body. Okay, these are going to have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And some different types of proteins we have enzymes, which we're going to talk a lot about in about a week and a half. Hormones, transport bridges across the cell membrane. So when we talk about cell membranes, we'll talk a lot about proteins. Hair has protein, the hemoglobin in your blood has protein, meat has protein, etc. Okay, the monomers of proteins are called amino acids. Okay, there are 20 amino acids, but as humans, we only make 12. All right, so we have to ingest other amino acids in order to get all 20. So this is why it's important that you eat proteins, so you're not missing those other 8 monomers. Okay, so for our very last macromolecule, we have nucleic acids. Okay, so these are polymers of a monomer unit called a nucleotide. So multiple nucleotides make up a nucleic acid. And nucleic acids, what these do, these are going to store information and help us make proteins in our cells. Okay, so storing information, these are going to be DNA and RNA, so our lovely genetic code. All right, these are what nucleotides look like. So these are our monomers of our nucleic acids. And what they're made up of, they are made up of a sugar. They are made up of a nitrogenous base. And they are made up of phosphate. Okay, so when we go to talk about DNA, all of these will come up. Okay, so we have this sugar group, this base, which could have 1 ring or 2. So either a stop sign or a stop sign and a little hexagon next to it. and then a phosphate group. All right, and that is the last of our macromolecules, and we'll just have one more video for the chemistry of life.